welcome to Dateline New Haven on WNHH-FM, New Haven's home for community radio. I'm Paul Bass, inviting you to look at the stories behind the headlines in our community. We have two people today who aren't always in the headlines, but have so much to do with what happens in New Haven, including the issue of the hour, which is the quest to reform policing, either reform or abolish policing in Connecticut and America, and to seek racial justice through law enforcement. I want to say good morning to Dr. Kalila L. Brown Dean. She's an associate professor of political science at Quinnipiac University, a well-known pundit, author, and as chair of the Community Foundation for Greater New Haven Board of Directors, someone has a lot to say with how resources are spent in our community. Good morning, Kalila. Nice to see you.
Good to be back, Paul. Thanks.
And Mike Lawler. He's a professor as well at University of New Haven. Used to be the top aide to the governor, Dan Malloy, who was in charge. He was the point person in reforming our criminal justice system, our prison system, so that he greatly reduced the number of people who are in prison in Connecticut, and also played a key behind-the-scene role in our last iteration of how to fix policing in our cities, which was Project Longevity and Operation Ceasefire. Good morning, Mike. Nice to see you both.
Morning, Paul.
So, so much is happening at the state level right now. A new set of recommendations released by Governor's Task Force, a special session teed up in Hartford to try to respond to this amazing outpouring on the streets of America and even private polling places that are blowing me away. So I want to ask you, before we go into the specifics, Kalila, what do you think about this moment? What was your reaction to the death of George Floyd and the reaction in America since the video was released?
So I, like many other people, was not surprised by what happened to George Floyd in Minneapolis. My heart broke, of course, because I thought, here we have again, where someone who has lost their life, and seemingly the person who did it showed no remorse, no concern for his most basic humanity. But Paul, I've also been surprised by the reaction. I'm someone who has been asking often lately, why now? Why did this murder move us in a way that the murder of a Tatiana Jefferson, who was a young woman standing in her own home in Texas, was shot through a window and killed? Why now, when we've seen these things happen repeatedly? And I think also when we think about the why now, the thing I've said to my colleagues is what now? How do we transition so that this is not just a moment, but really the start of a comprehensive movement that says enough, this cannot happen again. And if it does, there will be swift justice to bring dignity not only to the family of people like Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery, but really to restore that dignity of every person in our community who shouldn't have to live in fear.
And so, that struck me too, that oh my God, here's another case for the horrible thing that happens all the time in America, but how a vast majority of Americans, including Republicans, say they support Black Lives Matter. I feel like it was 7 minutes ago that we were fighting this whole idea that to even say Black Lives Matter was a controversial statement because people felt so defensive of white people that they're saying, you're saying our lives don't matter, when the whole point was just saying we need to say this because people aren't saying they matter. As a political scientist, Kalila, how do you parse these numbers?
So I want to remind people that Black Lives Matter as a movement and as an affirmation, it's more than just a slogan, more than just a hashtag, it is really an affirmation. That was launched in 2013 by 3 Black women who said enough after George Zimmerman was acquitted in murdering Trayvon Martin, because that is what happened in Florida. So it's taken 7 years for people to realize that it is not radical, it is not controversial to say that every person in this country should be able to live and not be in fear because of their race. And, as someone who studies American politics and public opinion, I have been amazed by how quickly public support has changed. But I'm also a lifelong skeptic. And so the question now is, how do we move from people being comfortable saying Black Lives Matter to having people being comfortable in taking action to make that a reality for all people, and not just a slogan that your favorite corporation or store or restaurant slaps up on a post to say, look, I'm an ally. Now's the time for people to show that they are.
Of course, that's going to require sustained support when it comes to passing bills. When even Lindsey Graham, Republican running for re-election as a senator, showing support for Donald Trump, who's sort of the last public figure in America saying we're not going to change the names of Army bases after Confederates and all that, going to that small base. How long those numbers show up in polling so that even people I would consider racist politicians feel they have to support these kind of measures. So that's one thing that before I turn to Mike, Kalila, again, getting in the weeds of political science, I'm looking at this amazing increase in numbers for support for Black Lives Matter. It was a 2-week period where I think it's like a 13 or 16% percentage point move, clear majorities. That, again, being a skeptic as well, I wonder, does that mean it can quickly move back when the first propaganda effort seeks to change it? So we all knew that they're going to try to get some picture that's going to scare mainstream Americans into thinking this is an assault on law and order. So Trump tried it with this idea that the 75-year-old peace protester in Buffalo was an Antifa plant forcing the cops to throw him down. That didn't work. But part of me wonders if they're going to keep trying to come up with some image to portray this incredibly peaceful movement as a threat to Americans. Do you worry about those numbers going back before we can enact meaningful change?
I don't worry about the numbers as much as I worry about the backlash and the counter mobilization that we are seeing very critically. You know, I think it's amazing. If you look at what is happening on the streets of America, you have people that are literally putting their bodies on the line between people who just want to damage property and just want to take advantage to say, no, you will not define this movement because we understand what's at stake. That is powerful for young people to protect a corporate entity. I won't name the store, but to say, don't do this in the name of Black Lives Matter because this is actually in opposition. And I think that the people who really believe in this movement and its potential understand what's at stake. We all do. We all know, and you know, I'm sure Mike knows this from all the work he's done in criminal justice reform. You are always one case away from someone saying, see, that's why we shouldn't have done away with this. See, that's why we shouldn't have abolished the death penalty, or we shouldn't have extended parole options for people. Because people will use that one outlier to try to discredit an entire movement and an entire effort without understanding the scale and the proportion.
It has been amazing. I got to watch up close at one rally I was at to see a woman in her 20s, Black Lives Matter, in the middle of a busy, confusing rally, make sure that those outliers don't happen, scanning the crowd, hearing the rumors, seeing someone who might be committing that one obnoxious act that could define the movement. Mike Lawler, you know, until 7 minutes ago, you were an outlier. You were promoting reform in policing, which has become the conservative position as opposed to abolition. And following up on what Kalila was talking about, under Dan Malloy, you guys first got rid of the death penalty. Then you dramatically reduced the number of people in prisons with the idea that nonviolent offenders, especially, although now the discussion has moved under Michelle Alexander to quote unquote violent offenders as well. But what did it take, as per Kalila's point, to bring sustained change in our policies toward the death penalty and incarceration when there still were those other images, counter mobilizations by people who wanted to preserve the status quo? I'm thinking Dan Malloy running for governor in 2010, it's a 1-point difference between the candidates, and the Cheshire murder case was happening. And his Republican opponent went publicly saying that's why we can't abolish the death penalty. How do you follow up on Claude's point and sustain this idea against those kind of populist appeals?
So that's quite a question, Paul, and it could be here for a while. But and they're all perfectly valid questions to ask. And you know, so let me just start by saying, when it comes to legislative politics and campaign politics, I'm a person with lived experience. You know, I've been there, done that. I represented East Haven, and I think it's fair to say that the abolition of the death penalty wasn't popular in East Haven. But the way the tide turned, not just on the death penalty, but on the mass incarceration and the sort of overuse of arrests and law enforcement and prosecutions and convictions in our state, was a lot of very detailed, data-driven, repetition of actual facts. And Paul, you've been a victim of this yourself. I can't tell you how much time I spent on the phone with journalists, just kind of going through everything you would need to know to.
No, not a victim. That's something you just said is very important. I always feel privileged when you would call me up and show that we missed a really important fact when you're writing something about criminal justice. So I think what you're saying, Mike Lawler, is that the people in the trenches, in addition to the protests we need and the mass appeals, you need people who are in the weeds of policy, who are watching the information being disseminated by reporters and public figures, and in under 20 seconds dialing the phone and saying that fact's wrong. Do you want to fix it?
Yeah, without like criticizing everybody. It's just like it's a fact.
Your manner was great, but like I always appreciated it. Yeah.
No, well, I'm glad you appreciate it, and I think that's a really important job, not just for elected officials, but for judges and prosecutors and police chiefs. And so often, erroneous information goes out there and is not corrected. I think people have an obligation to explain how the system works, explains what works well, what doesn't work well, and propose ways to fix it. But getting back to your point about the political side of this, the public opinion / campaign related side of criminal justice reform, in my classes, I typically will show my students, who are often in the 18, 19, 20, 21 years old, none of them know who Willie Horton was. That name does not ring a bell with any of them. And then I show them those ads from 1988. I mean, that's exactly, to this day, you will hear legislative candidates, more Democrats than Republicans, saying, I can't do that because what if something bad happens and a mailing goes out against me in a campaign?
And we have seen this today, to your point, Mike. I was reading the Times this morning. Republican senators are testing slogans like abolish and defund mean more rapists and robbers.
Of course. I mean, that's what they're going to say. But the interesting thing, and I just want to go back to something you said earlier about Governor Malloy and all the reforms, the goal wasn't to just have fewer people incarcerated. The goal was to reduce crime, right? Because if you can reduce crime, you can have fewer people are going to get arrested and fewer people are going to be incarcerated. That's exactly what happened. And I think that's counterintuitive to a lot of people. Like, you can actually have an impact on crime. And ironically, by arresting more people, by putting more people on probation, by incarcerating more people, generally speaking, that will increase, not reduce crime. And I think
the reason is that they get dug deeper into holes rather than having the root causes of what led them to crime in the first place addressed.
But, now we're talking about policing reform, and it's decisions that police officers make on the very front lines that often put individuals on a trajectory for failure, right? So the decision to arrest somebody, send them to court, or all the formalities, result, the odds that someone who already is dealing with substance abuse or homelessness or mental illness is going to make all their court appearances are low. They're going to get a rearrest warrant out for them. Did you know right now, I mean, I was just looking up some data a little while ago, right now in our state, in the state of Connecticut, there are 41,000 outstanding rearrest warrants for people who at one point or another didn't show up in court. 41,000. Of that 41,000, 85% are for misdemeanor charges for which they were supposed to go to court. And most of those people went to court 2, 3, 4 times and then stopped showing up. And I'll guarantee you, and I think this is verifiable, that the vast majority of those people are people of color, right? And so some of those warrants are from 15, 20 years ago, right? And so this is just an example of how the reach of the mission creep of criminal justice system has expanded. And by shrinking that, we make it more likely that people can be successful. And if we can find a way at the very front end to give police or local officials more options besides simply arresting people, then the odds that more people will be successful because of our interventions start going way up. And that's what's actually happened in New Haven. New Haven has really closed down the school to prison pipeline. They've reduced the number of suspensions and expulsions in our school system. And now, fast forward like 10 years, you see the number of young people being arrested is down 68% compared to 2009. And the number of people—
That's the number of young people arrested or totally arrested?
Young people under the age of 25. And those numbers are reported every year by every police department. And, the caseloads in courts are down 30, 40%. If you look at who's incarcerated today in the Department of Correction, and you divide it into 3 groups, inmates under the age of 30, inmates between the age of 30 and 40, and then those over the age of 40. It used to be very consistent that the under 30-year-olds were by far the biggest cohort in the State Department of Correction. Now they are the smallest cohort and dropping every single year. The over 40-year-olds are increasing in numbers and in percentages. So it just goes to show you that you can have these extraordinary changes. They take some time, and they take a lot of tweaking of policy as you go. And the reason I'm stressing this is because when people say stuff like those changes will result in more murders and rapes, et cetera, they can now be contradicted with actual facts, the actual experience here in Connecticut. So that's my abbreviated.
All right, we're talking to Mike Lawler and Kalila Brown Dean about what next with policing and criminal justice at this key moment. So I want to ask you, Kalila, to put your political science hat back on. Now, I heard that some of you political scientists make big money sort of consulting the candidates with all your knowledge about public opinion and all that. I'm just teasing you there. But I want to ask you something about, so what Mike seemed to be saying was that in the last phase of seeking criminal justice reform and social justice, we had to convince Connecticut of something counterintuitive that's hard to do with the sound bites from the other side. We had to convince them that arresting fewer people, putting fewer people on parole, putting fewer people in jail will actually lead to less crime. In fact, it did. There are numbers, but it's still so counterintuitive. Would you agree with me that now the challenge is to convince people that less policing will mean less crime rather than what everyone's going to be told is you call 911, someone's got a gun to your head, no cop.
Right. And
okay.
I think
how are you going to do that?
One of the things that is most important here that we've seen across our state and really across the nation is the power of language and how the language that you use communicates your values. Let me give you an example. When I grew up in the 90s, everything was about the war on drugs. You know, people were referred to crackheads and crack addicts. Addiction was seen as a moral indictment. Now we talk about the opioid abuse disorder, right? Because the idea is that we don't want to stigmatize and label people by leading with their challenge. Instead, we want to affirm their humanity. So that language meant that the way that we deal with addiction in this country today is vastly different. We now know that locking up someone battling an active addiction in addition to mental health will not help them, because once they are released, they've got to feed that addiction some way. And if in this country where the collateral consequences of a conviction mean that you have limited housing options, you have limited job prospects, especially in this COVID economy, you have limited ways to take care of your family, then if we say to people that not just locking up a bunch of people will get us to the outcome that we want. And I think that idea of defunding is very different, because the best way to keep people from going back to prison is to keep them out of the system to begin with. And I think what Mike also alluded to that I think is so important about convincing people, it's not just the one person that you've arrested and that gets locked up. It's about that impact on family and community. What is it for young people who see that instability, who experience that trauma in multiple ways? And, you know, I also know from the movement to abolish the death penalty, what moved people was not trying to appeal to their hearts, it was appealing to their pockets, so that people understand if we are better allocating those precious taxpayer dollars toward prevention, toward diversion, toward actually changing people's life so they feel connected and then act in a way that is positive, it actually saves us on the back end. And that is the language that people have to use to get them to understand. We all want to feel safe. We all should feel safe. And if I don't feel safe, I should be able to call 911 and get help. But I also know that if someone is in a mental health crisis, what that person needs is not to be confronted with a gun or a taser, but to be able to know, here are the resources so you can get the help that you need and actually be a productive member of our community.
I guess one question you and Mike addressed this is whether we train police officers to keep the gun away and address it, or now at the movement seems to be asking is not having to be a cop, because community policing, you know what I'm finding one of the ironies of the current moment is that the arguments made by conservative anti-reform people a decade ago are partly the arguments of the new group. There are obviously key differences, including race. But when community policing dawned, the people who didn't want it say cops aren't social workers. Cops can't deal with all these other problems. They're trained to arrest people and stop you from getting killed. Now, these deeper problems with somebody else. They kind of lost that argument in New Haven. I think there's a lot of progress in New Haven. It wasn't perfect. And now the people who are calling for defunding and abolition say cops aren't social workers. Same quote. They'll never be social workers. They're not trained for that. It's a military organization. So I guess I'd be interested, each of you, the full circle there, have you changed your minds? Do you still want to see the police force exist and be trained in what was the community policing model? And now some people saying the new movement, the younger generation, community policing is over policing. The sort of middle generation, I'm still hearing, I want the Obama model. I want my community cops who like are assigned to the walk and beat and knowing me. I hear this generationally in the Hill within 2 days. One woman in the Hill in 20 said, they've always bothered us. I see a cop, that means there's trouble. I don't want the cops around. A woman in her 60s saying, I've seen when cops are long enough in our neighborhood walk the beat, know who's who, and they're part of our community. I want more of that. Where do you two stand on that?
What I don't think it's an easy either or. And that's the sort of nuance and context that I've been pushing people from various perspectives. I want police officers to know the community that they serve, and that they serve is important. I want those officers to know the community, to respect the community, so that there is a reciprocal relationship of trust and respect there. Everybody wants the same thing. If you have that relationship, it means that residents feel safer. Residents have someone that they can go to when they need help, but it also makes it safer for the officers who are putting their lives on the line. Because when you have that respect, the community will show that to you and work together. So I think that's important. On the other hand, no, police officers are not social workers. That, however, does not mean that they should not have required ongoing training in understanding things like mental health and addiction, knowing what the services are in their area, knowing where people can go, not because they're a police officer, but because they are a public servant. And that's what we are charged to do.
So would I be correct in hearing your answer as to the question of either or, yes and yes? Yes, a smaller police department that has fewer functions and doesn't see cops as social workers and does fewer tasks, but there still be a police department. You want them trained the way we talked about community policing until 7 minutes ago.
I'm totally yes and yes to that. Yes, we need that. Yes, we need people to have that understanding and that commitment, and to be clear that if that is not the job that you want to do, then perhaps there's a different career path, because where we are today is not where we were 70 years ago when people thought about their approach to policing.
So Mike, I think that Kalila kind of gave a very cogent response with the yes, yes. I am interested because you've spent so much time as sort of every day trying to convince people to a model that was embraced by Obama and now is, I think, rejected by the younger activists of trying to reform policing. They say it can't be reformed. I mean, I think at the end of the day, on the ground, when this is all over, the ideal vision is Kalila's. There'll be a small police force for these emergencies and people will be trained more humanely. But do you see a shift in what you're arguing and what people want from the community policing model? And also, you involved in Project Longevity, where we use a lot of data to identify the small number of people most at risk of committing violent crime or being victims, focusing local, state, and federal resources on them, saying you can go to jail for a long time, prison a long time, but here's some alternatives to go straight, but they rarely pick that go straight option.
So I think I'll just make a prediction, right? In the future, there'll be fewer police officers and more social workers, right? Mm-hmm. And I think that's basically what Will was just articulating. And I think most people who've really thought a lot about this come down on that side. I think in the future, the bad police are not going to be happy. They're going to be miserable, and the good police are going to be overjoyed that the resources and the options they always wanted to have will be made available. And so, we've been talking a lot about, my colleagues and I and others, I've been talking a lot about this in recent weeks. And, one thing that comes to my mind, I think everyone understands how, there used to be police and firefighters, right? Firefighters responded to fires and put the fires out. Police responded to complaints and made arrests. And that changed a little bit with community policing, also changed a little bit with firefighters. What was added to the mix over time were EMTs, which is a new status, right? So
we're undoing that.
Well, maybe, but I'm just saying that the status of EMT is a specialist who is especially trained to respond to people who are experiencing a medical emergency. And like at our university, at the University of New Haven, we have a major. You can major in EMT, and so I think you're going to see something similar in the broad category of policing. And whether or not they're actually part of a police department is another issue. But I think what you're going to see is the evolution of a new type of professional who would respond to routine drama, which certainly constitutes the vast majority of police work, and deal with it in a non-threatening way. No badges, no guns, no body armor, basically talking people down. And I was a prosecutor for a while, and I can't tell you the percentage. I can't tell you what a large percentage of the work was just routine drama where no one was in danger of getting hurt unless the situation got escalated. And now you're in a situation where the police tend to be dressed and equipped like a gladiator in a way, and I think people have remarked how if the perception in the community is that the police are really an army of occupation consisting mainly of people who live in other towns and other community, this type of situation doesn't help to calm situations down. So I do think in the future, what you're going to see come out of all of these discussions is the development of an alternative sort of policing mechanism, which probably won't be called the police for a bunch of reasons, but will respond to incidents, so that 911 operators have a lot more options than to simply send the police. And
we have 100,000 calls a year in New Haven. Does that sound right?
I don't know.
911, but half for routine stuff that they think wouldn't need to go to police.
And the good news is New Haven has a relatively sophisticated operation for doing triage on those phone calls. A lot of places in the country don't. They just send the police. And so I think that's what you're going to see evolve out of this. And the real issue is, will resources be put in place that can make this real, right? We had the same challenge with schools. There was a big push on to reduce the number of suspensions and expulsions and school-based arrests, right? And it's one thing to say there should be fewer of those. It's another thing to talk directly with a teacher or a school administrator saying, well, what are we supposed to do with a kid disrupting the entire school? So we said, we're going to put in place lots of other options. I mean, there's a whole state funding thing called the School-Based Diversionary Initiative, SBDI. They're invited into districts. They provide resources. New Haven is a model for this, right? They have a very elaborate juvenile review board. They had the youth stat program. I mean, these are informal ways of managing kids who oftentimes, especially in the cities, are victims of extraordinary trauma growing up. And, I've certainly been in the youth prison before it closed, and I've been in the adult prison for young kids. And you talk to those kids, first of all, almost all of them, almost every single one is a kid of color. And secondly, they all have a very similar story. It doesn't minimize the misconduct they've got themselves involved with, but you can see how this happened, right? And having trauma-informed responses to young people who are acting out is a way to make it more likely they'll be successful going forward. And I think that is the reason why the number of arrests of young people have dropped so dramatically in our state, because we've just taken a different approach to responding to those issues.
And we're talking about where we're going next with law enforcement change. Kalila L. Brown Dean and Mike Lawler on WNHH's Dateline New Haven, 103.5 FM, live streamed at newhavenindependent.org. Kalila, when you're listening to Mike talk about what's going to happen next, we'll be left with a smaller force of what we now consider police. At least half or more of the calls that used to go to 911 will go to some new kind of professional who is not a police officer, no badge, no gun, to try to talk down people when there's not a sense that there might be violence. Is that, and with a lot more supports put in place to help people who are in trouble, do you see that as the future? What's your goal? What's your model that you see for where we go next?
Paul, I think when I think about the model and the future, I come from a family where law enforcement is very important in our family. Military service is very important. So I understand that journey. I understand how it is for people to go to work every day and feel like they are going to face a challenge simply because people have resentment toward them. And that same resentment is what many people face or feel in the neighborhood when they have those encounters. Again, I am a perpetual skeptic. I do not think that we should underestimate the power of police unions and correctional unions the same way that many correctional unions resisted the changes in terms of prisons and criminal justice reform overall, not just in Connecticut, but really across the nation. I think that that is also important. When you talk about the ways in which fear will become a part of the discussion, that some of the ads already write themselves of people saying, is this the city that you want? So how we get there, when we get there, I think that we need to be honest about how long and complicated that is, because it's a delicate dance between wanting to be safe and understanding that your budget, we're hitting July 1. Your municipal budget is a moral commitment and a moral document about what you prioritize. And if we don't do something different, the next time there is a murder of a George Floyd or of a Rekia Jones, we're going to be right back here again of people saying, what is the commitment and how do we do that? And the other thing that I want to say, Paul, that I think it's so important, and a lot of my friends who are in law enforcement have reached out to me and said, but you know me, I'm not like that. Of course you aren't. But people aren't talking about individuals right now. What they're focused on is systemic change and systemic challenge. And we have to arrest that notion, and I use that intentionally, that it's just about a couple of bad actors. Because if the system protects those bad actors, then it also endangers the lives of the good actors. So instead of just thinking, let's reduce the size of the force, we need to think about how do we dismantle a structure that allows that protection, and for people who could be fired from one jurisdiction to then go and be employed in another jurisdiction without any sort of database or knowledge of the threat that they are to the public because of their past action. So I'm interested in systemic change that is not just about incremental changes around the margin until people have moved on to the next thing that garners their outrage.
So you talk about your skepticism based on what's in the past. Let's also talk about optimism. I want to talk about generations. I'm talking about 3 generations here. The people leading these protests are in their 20s and young 30s. Kalila, I believe in your 40s? No?
The South, Paul, you never ask a woman her age. But
then,
yes, I am. Proud of it.
Mike and I are from one generation older.
I'm 63.
And I'm 60. So Mike talked about Willie Horton. People in their 20s don't remember that Willie Horton ad about how you could shut down a whole conversation about any intelligent look at criminal justice reform just by scaring white voters of a black rapist. You don't even have to put his picture in the ad. Everybody knows what you're talking about.
Right.
So I think sometimes younger people benefit from not being haunted by how things worked in the past. The Berlin Wall came down in 1989, right? Or was it 90? 89.
November 11th.
So we couldn't imagine that could ever happen. Younger people just jumped on the wall and walked over.
Sorry.
And then, Mike Lawler comes from a generation, came from East Haven, where you couldn't be openly gay and win election, especially in a town like East Haven. Now we saw gay marriage become the law of the land in such a rapid process that for someone in my generation, I just thought it wasn't possible. Mm-hmm. To my daughter, there was no other alternative, right? It can be done. When you look at East Haven policing, the most notorious police force, racist police force, violent police force in our area, when the federal government took action, they actually changed it with the help of community groups. So my question, you're kind of in the middle there, Kalila. You've seen more things possible, but you are of a generation to have been disappointed more than the younger people demanding the change. So in addition to being a professional skeptic, how are you feeling about this moment when you know what's coming next with these activists, these Democrats? Joe Biden wants to have rapists and robbers run rampant. Are you with the younger people who say, don't cow to that, go lead with what can be possible because it can be possible and it will be possible? Or are you like an old head like me that just shivers in fear remembering what's happened in the past?
So, Paul, one of the things I talk about in my book is that every meaningful movement for change in this country has been inspired by, led by, and empowered by young people. And even in my skepticism, what I refuse to do, and what I say to other people, what I refuse to do is to allow my skepticism to get in the way of young people's energy and their commitment. And I think that for people of my generation and older, yes, in some ways we're cynical because we remember Willie Horton. You know, I teach about that in my class. I teach on power and punishment. We remember Rodney King. We remember even Trayvon Martin, because a lot of my students, that seems so long ago that they don't understand what that meant for a prosecutor to decide how they were going to charge a person and how that then sets in motion. And so even if we are skeptical, even if we know what will come, the best thing that we can do in this moment and in the broader movement is to not step in the way of what young people are doing and demanding. To me, it is encouraging that in spite of all that has transpired in this country, young people are not deterred by that. That instead, in many ways, they're inspired by that. When I talk to my younger relatives who say to me, you know, you've been doing this thing for a long time. Now look how we use technology to connect people. And in my little hometown, they created a bail fund overnight. They weren't thinking about, oh, well, we need to do this, and maybe we need to ask for this person. And if you have a press conference, you have to make sure that this gatekeeper is there. Young people said, no, we will take our message directly to the streets in a powerful way. That's what actually gives me hope. That's what gives me hope as a parent. It's what gives me hope as an educator. And what I know that in these moments, that hope becomes an act of resistance that others cannot take away.
And I'll give you just a little example from my corner of the world. When the Black Lives Matter march 2 Sundays ago, I went to I-95, which was not the plan. They were making up on the fly because it wasn't their march at first. We're heading on to I-95 and they have the state troopers. So I'm looking at 60 years of experience, including 3 years ago, when those same state troopers set dogs on a much, much smaller group on a mini highway. And I said, okay, this is it. You're going on the highway. You can't just walk on a highway. They're not going to stop the highway. They're coming at you. And even they said, get ready for the tear gas. But I was convinced. I said, it wasn't if, it was when. Yeah. So they went on the highway and there was this jubilation that felt like a mini Berlin Wall when they claimed the highway, 1,000 people. They walked right past the troopers. And I said to one trooper, so like, are you guys going to do anything? He said, nah, as long as no violence, it's all right. I was thinking, wow, that changed because of how the young people thought. So where's the specific answer in this, Kalila? You so importantly point out that we have to let young people lead because they can see the possible, whereas we think of the reasons not to dream, not to aspire. What does that mean when they also need the basis of understanding history? So a lot of people over 50 on Facebook, liberals and lefties, are saying, stop with the word abolition, stop with the word defund, because they're going to use that as against Joe Biden, and we're going to have 4 more years of fascism emboldened. What is the specific? How is that going to work out in the election? What's your take on that?
The specific in this election is that it doesn't matter what term you use. Those who are opposed to progress or opposed to change are going to find a way. And so, you know, I've listened to my fellow political scientists, you know, really upset and trying to wordsmith and saying to activists, stop saying defund, stop saying abolish, call it reform. Well, we had decades of school reform that didn't materialize into meaningful substantive change in the lives of young people who pursue public school and public education. And so it really doesn't matter what you call it. We already know that the mantra will be Nixon 2.0, this is law and order, this is why we need to crack down. When you have people who label people exercising their First Amendment right to assembly, labeled as un-American and as terrorists, it doesn't matter what you call yourself, someone else will find a way to do that. What is important in this moment is however you define it, whatever the vision is, that people commit to registering and to, I wouldn't be a good political scientist, Paul, if I didn't say this, that people commit to registering, that they commit to voting, that they commit to addressing the barriers and the really defined efforts to suppress that vote, no matter where you are. Because no one is naive enough to think that just voting, changing who's in office, will erase 200 years of what's developed. But what I do know is that when people are registered to vote, they have the opportunity to be on a jury to determine the outcome, in this case, of the officers who murdered George Floyd. When they are registered to vote, they have the opportunity to select an attorney general or a prosecutor or a mayor or a police chief who can have these effects on people's everyday lives. That's where language matters, not in terms of how the opposition uses it, but how you use it to affirm and inspire the platform that you pursue.
So are you partly arguing, Kalila, as well, rather than let your opponents decide what your language means or what language you use? You choose your language to define what you want, you embrace it, and then you define it and you get out front of it. Rather than try to pretend you're what you're not, you argue for what you are.
I have lived my whole entire life with people struggling to pronounce my name, Paul. And I know that the name that my mother gave me is the name that I answer to, no matter what anyone else says. And so people need to define what their mission is. What's the demand? What is the demand? Power concedes nothing without a demand. What is the demand of those in power and of ourselves as communities, multiple communities? That's what you answer to. That's what you organize around, instead of trying to make your demand comfortable and palatable to people who are dead set against opposing it anyway.
Michael Lawler, when you heard Kalila speak about that, were you having the same memories I had of President Clinton think you gradually go for justice on gay discrimination by starting out with don't ask, don't tell in the military, which then boomeranged and led to more discrimination. And then the next step was, well, we want civil unions. We don't want the same thing as marriage. That was a huge fight. There were some steps forward and back. And then all of a sudden, when people made the case clear-throated justice, gay marriage, that happened much faster. And it happened in the way that proponents hoped. Did you have the same reaction to that? Is that the lesson here as we look forward at criminal justice?
Yeah, so I'm, first of all, I'm a big optimist. Second of all, I'm an incrementalist. I definitely believe in it. But to your fundamental question, Paul, about the language that are being used by the advocates, I'm all for it. Use the most strident language that you feel comfortable with, because that's what drives public opinion. It really does. And there is a downside, right? It can be manipulated in just the same way that Black Lives Matter was countered with, well, all lives matter. And we know what that was all about. And now you're hearing the defund the police is like as if there's going to be no, as if anarchy is the is the goal. That's okay. I mean, I think that strident point of view gets you to an outcome. And you referenced the battle over marriage equality here in Connecticut. Andrew McDonald, who's now on the Supreme Court, and I were vilified by national gay advocates because we agreed to go forward with civil unions in 2005. As opposed to full marriage equality. And by the way, the only difference between those two things was just what they were called. All the rules, the rights and all were the same. But we were vilified for that. But we were 100% confident that that was an important step to take to get to the ultimate outcome of full marriage equality. And of course, we're proven right when the state Supreme Court rendered the decision saying that civil unions was basically a form of separate but equal, right? And so I'm all for the incremental steps, but I think it's so important to have the strident advocates pushing as far as you can possibly get, because that's what drives the narrative. And I just want to say one thing, because at the beginning, Paul, you had asked about what's different about this situation. So it's not just the reaction to Mr. Floyd's murder. It's also very relevant that this is happening in the midst of the COVID pandemic. People don't have the number of distractions they would normally have, right? I think people are very much getting back in touch with the reality of their lives and what their moral underpinnings are. I think it's just a very different time. People are thinking about life very differently right now. Plus, and this might actually be the most important factor, is that this presidential election that looms 6 months ahead has got people focused on the fundamental values of the country, right? In a way that's never been the case before. We're not talking about side issues. We're talking about basic fundamental issues, competent leadership, morality, equality, putting children in cages on the border, all this stuff. I think people are just viewing these things very differently now because, one thing, I think you know this, Paul, maybe you don't know this, Delilah, but when I was in college and graduate school, my focus was Eastern European and Soviet studies. I studied in the Soviet Union, I studied in Hungary, I got arrested in Poland for taking fire. I had a lot of experiences there, and I learned a lot about the aftermath of the Second World War. And for like 40 years, I've always had the thought, what would I have done if I was a German in the early 1930s? How would I have responded to that? And I think many people in this country came to the realization that for the first time in our lives, we have to speak out against what clearly is underway on a national level. And I think in this case, we're talking about the way African Americans are treated by the police. There's a much broader discussion about mass incarceration, not to mention anti-Muslim, anti-Latino discrimination, anti-gay, the whole gamut. I think people really are focused on this more than any time before. And so all of these things happening simultaneously, I think, is what's given rise to this sort of epiphany that many people are experiencing. Like, maybe we should take this stuff seriously, because maybe this is what the country was all about in the first place. I mean, after all, yesterday, NASCAR announced that, number one, they're banning Confederate flags, and number two, they're no longer banning kneeling during the night or otherwise protesting during
President Trump overruled the Pentagon, which was going to rename bases named after Confederate generals who were fighting against the United States for the right to enslave people. I think it's pretty clear what's at stake now.
Right, and the important thing there is the Pentagon had decided to do it. I mean, we all know what Trump's issues are, but the point is, like, this is really changed. You saw the general this morning, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, issued an apology in a commencement address for accompanying the president wearing battle fatigues to disperse peaceful protests. I mean, something very significant is happening here, and the least likely people, NASCAR, General Tilly, or Milley, these people, I mean, the fact that this is changing is very, very significant. And I've been speaking with a lot of, policymakers on the state level and the local level. Said, you need to think in terms of taking advantage of what is in your lap right now. I mean, should Vice President Biden be elected and take office next January, and should the Democrats take the United States Senate, that there will be a huge amount of money coming through the pipeline to make these things that we've been discussing a reality, because the money has to be there to make alternatives a reality. So it's an important moment.
You bring it home, Delilah. What was your reaction to what Mike was saying?
I think, Mike, your comments led to a point that I think is so important here. And that is, we have to recognize the tremendous diversity that exists within communities. And just as we don't want to paint all police with one broad stroke, we have to also understand that we have to stop relying on a single voice or a single set of voices when we talk about this. And I think COVID makes that clear. A lot of people started this year thinking that they were okay. They had a good job, they had an education, they were playing by the rules, they were planning a vacation. And then instantly we understand just how vulnerable many people are in this country to things over which they have no control. And just as people have resisted having to wear a mask and thinking it's oppressive that you can't go to your favorite restaurant because of the rules in place, think about how people feel when they can't move into a neighborhood to be able to get a better education opportunity for their child because of longstanding tensions and rules in place that make that mobility a challenge. And I think as we are thinking about this isn't just about reforming police. It isn't just about addressing these latest murders. It is a broader opportunity for us to take a step back and ask ourselves, all of us, regardless of our station in life, regardless of the groups to which we belong, whether we're born into them or we are selected into them based on affiliation. to ask ourselves, what is the country that we want? What is the community that we want? And then the question is, what are we going to do to get ourselves there? If you are an entrepreneur and a businessman and you really only care about your profit and your bottom line, what will it mean if you don't have a workforce to select from, because we have not addressed the structural institutional dynamics that make certain lives better able to be pursued than others? And so I hope we'll see it within that context when we're listening to young people, when we're engaging in elections. You know, the president is about to launch his rallies in Oklahoma, Tulsa, Oklahoma, on Juneteenth.
Juneteenth, that blew me away. That was like Reagan going to Philadelphia, Mississippi to launch his campaign.
Well, also keep in mind, Paul, that in 2016, Donald Trump Jr. and Peyton Manning went back to the Neshoba County Fair in Philadelphia, Mississippi. It's not a dog whistle anymore. There's a subtlety to a dog whistle. This is a blatant appeal that says, on Juneteenth, I'm going to return to the site, one of the worst racist attacks in the history of this country, to decimate an entire community. That's what activists, what young people and their allies are saying right now. Reject that. Regardless of your political affiliation, regardless of your ideology, say that is not consistent. And if in fact we care about law enforcement and military, on my mantle right now are two flags, two American flags, one for my father, one for my father-in-law, who both fought in the Vietnam War. This is not what they fought for. So someone taking a knee does not offend me as much as it does to know that someone will play on that pain that has lasted for generations.
Eric Russell says, great conversation. Two of my favorite people too, Eric Russell.
Eric's the best.
We agree.
Also, Haley Stone Loddick says, also educate people what defund the police actually means, and to be so rich. Says, just what I needed. Just what I needed too. Thanks so much for joining us this morning, Kalila Brown Dean, Mike Lawler. You might have seen the behind Kalila, there was a book called Identity Politics in the United States. She wrote it. I read it. I recommend it. And if you notice, the clock behind Mike Lawler shows that we're out of time. So thanks for joining us today for a great conversation. Keep up the great work you do. And let's end with that optimistic note with a sense of realism, skepticism, but moving forward. I want to thank Kalila Brown Dean and Mike Lawler for joining us at Dateline Haven. I want to thank the miracle man behind the controls, WNHA station manager Harry Drosen, for the thanks who listen. We're going to take it out with the Afro-Semitic Experience performing I Wish I Knew How It Would Feel to Be Free from the group CD, A Plea for Peace. This is Paul Bass inviting you to fly free with us all day and all night long on WNHH, New Haven's home for community radio.